Chapter 34 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. We talk in ladies' chambers, love and news. Cowley. All was bustle and preparation at the court of England, for the two most magnificent monarchs of the world were about to contend with each other, not with the strife of arms, nor by a competition of great deeds, but in pomp, in pageant, and in show, in empty glitter and unfruitful display. However that may be, the palace and all its precincts became the Elysium of tailors, embroiderers, and sempstresses. There might be seen many a shadowy form gliding about from apartment to apartment, with smiling looks and extended shears, or armed with ell-wands, more potent than Mercury's road, driving many a poor soul to perdition, and transforming his goodly acres into velvet suits with tags of cloth of gold. The courts of the king's palace of Bridewell rang from morning till night with the neighing of steeds, the clanking of harness, and the sound of the trumpet; and the shops and warehouses of London were nearly emptied of gold, jewels, and brocade. Men and women were all wild to outdo their French equals in splendour and display, and in short, the mad dog of extravagance seemed to have bitten all the world. In a small room in the palace, not far from the immediate apartments of the queen, sat a very lovely girl, whom the reader has not spoken to for a long time, no other than Lady Katrine Bulmer, who, with a more pensive air than was usual with her, sat deep in the mysteries of bibs and tuckers, chaperons and phrases, mantuas and hanging sleeves, which last had, for the moment, regained their ascendancy in the public taste, and were now ornamented with more extraordinary trimmings than ever. By her side sat two women, Geraldine and Bridget, whose fingers were going with the rapidity of lightning, quickened into excessive haste by the approaching removal of the court to Calais, which was to take place in the short space of 1 week, while their mistresses' dresses were not half finished, and their own not begun. What it was that occupied Lady Katrine's thoughts and made her gay face look grave, is nothing to any one. Perhaps it might be that she had not as many dresses as Lady Winifred Stanton. Perhaps she had seen a jewel that she could not afford to buy. Perhaps Higglemeasure, the merchant, had brought her a brocade that the queen would not let her wear. Perhaps she was vexed at not having seen Lord Derby for 8 days, the last time having been on the same morning that Sir Osborne Maurice had been driven from the court. Perhaps she was angry with herself for having parted from him with an affectation of indifference which she did not feel. Well aware that, now Wolsey had returned, the pleasure of seeing her lover almost daily must cease, and that stiff and formal interviews, in presence of the whole court, or a few brief sentences at a masque or pageant, were all they could hope to attain, Lady Katrine did indeed repent that she had suffered her own caprices to mingle any bitter in the few happy hours that fate had sent her. Though she had some vanity too, she had not enough to prevent her seeing and regretting that she had been in fault, and she made those resolutions of amendment which a light spirit often forms every hour, and breaks before the next; and thus sewing and thinking and sewing, and stitching in excellent determinations with every scene as she went along, she resolved in her own mind all the various events that had lately happened at the court. It may well be supposed that the sudden disappearance of Sir Osborne Maurice, at the same time as that of Lady Constance de Grey, had given rise to many strange rumours, none of which, of course, did Lady Katrine believe; and, to do her justice, although perhaps she was not at all sorry that Constance had judged it right to put an end to any further proceedings regarding her marriage with Lord Derby, by removing herself from the court, yet Lady Katrine suffered no one to hint a doubt in her presence regarding her friend's conduct. But that which was much more in Constance's favour was the good word of the queen herself, who at once silenced scandal by saying that she would take upon herself to assert that Lady Constance de Grey had never dreamed of flying from the court with Sir Osborne Maurice. It was very natural, she observed, that a young heiress of rank and wealth and proud family should take refuge anywhere rather than contract a marriage to which she had always expressed her repugnance, and without meaning offence to the Lord Cardinal, she could not think but that Constance was right. Notwithstanding this, many were the tales that were circulated by the liemongers of the court, and it hurt the really generous heart of Lady Katrine to hear them. Meditating then over all these circumstances, nearly in the same desultory way in which they were here written down, she took little notice when one of the servants of the palace called her maid Geraldine out of the room. After a short while, Geraldine came back and called out Bridget, and still Lady Katrine continued to work on. After a moment or two she ceased, and leaning her head on her hand, gave herself up to still deeper thought, when suddenly the door opened and Lord Darby presented himself. Too much taken by surprise to give herself any airs, Lady Katrine looked up with a smile of unaffected delight, and Darby, reading his welcome in her eyes, advanced, and casting his arm round her, imprinted a warm kiss on the full arching lips that smiled too temptingly for human philosophy to resist. Luckily did it happen that he did so within the first minute, for had he waited later, Lady Katrine might not so easily have pardoned his boldness. However, her only remark was, "Well, Darby, you seem to think it so much a matter of course, that I suppose I too must let it pass as such. But don't look so happy, man, lest I should take it into my head to make you look otherwise before you go." "Nay, nay, Katrine," said Lord Darby, "not so, when I come solely for the purpose of asking you to make me happy." The earl spoke seriously, tenderly, and there was so much hope, and affection, and feeling in his glance, that Lady Katrine felt there must be some meaning in his words. "If you love me, Darby," cried she, "tell me what you mean, and make haste, for my maids will be back, and you know you must not stay here." "Yes, I may, Katrine," replied he. "No one but you can now send me away. In a word, dear girl, to put an end to suspense, I have the king's and the cardinal's consent to ask your hand, and the queen's to seek you here. Will you refuse me?" Lady Katrine looked at him for a moment, to be sure, quite sure, that what she heard was true. Then, dropping her head upon his shoulder, she burst into a violent flood of tears. So sudden, so delightful was the change in all her feelings, that she was surprised out of all her reserve, all her coquetry, and could only murmur, "Refuse you? No!" But starting up, at length she cried, "I have a great mind that I will, too. Don't think that I love you. No, I hate you most bitterly for making me cry. You did it on purpose, beyond doubt, and I won't forgive you easily. So, to begin your punishment, go away and leave me directly." "Nay, Katrine, I must disobey," replied the earl, "for I have other news to tell you. Your relation, Lord Orham, is dead." "My relation?" cried Lady Katrine, whose tears were ever dried as soon as shed. "Oh yes, I remember. He was my great-grandfather's 70th cousin by the mother's side. One was descended from Shem, and the other from Japheth, in the time of the flood, or before, for aught I know. Well, what of my antediluvian relative? Oh, he is dead, you say? May he rest with Noah!" "But you must make mourning for him," said Lord Darby, laughing. "Indeed you must." "Certainly," replied Lady Katrine. "A coif and a widow's hood. But I won't be teased, Darby. I will tease everybody, and nobody shall tease me. As to going into mourning for the old miser just now, when all my finery is ready made, to show myself a guine, and captivate all hearts, and make you fight 50 single combats, I won't do it. There, go and ask my singing bird to moult in the month of May, or anything else of the same kind, but don't ask me to leave one single row of lace off my sleeve for the miser. I disown him." "Hush, hush, hush!" cried the earl. "Take care he does not come back and disown you, for otherwise you are his heiress." "I!" exclaimed Lady Katrine. "Am I his heiress? Now, Mistress Fortune, I am your very humble servant. Bless us! How much more important a person Katrine Bulmer will be, with all the heavy coffers of her late dear cousin, than when she was poor Katrine Bulmer, the queen's woman. Darby, I give you notice, I shall not marry you. I could wed a duke now, doubtless. Who shall it be? All the dukes have wives, I do believe. However, there is many a peer richer than you are, and though you do not count cousinship with kings, gold is my passion now, so I will sell myself to him who has the most." Though she spoke in jest, still Lord Darby was mortified. For what he could have borne and laughed at in the poor and fortuneless girl who had captivated his heart, his spirit was too proud to endure when a mercenary motive could be for a moment attributed to him. "Nay, Katrine," said he, "if the fortune that is now yours give you any wish for change, your promises are to me null. I render them back to you from this moment." "Why, they were made under very different circumstances, you must allow, Lord Darby," replied she, assuming a most malicious air of gravity, and delighted at having found, for the first time in her life, the means of putting her lover out of humour. "They were, Lady Katrine," answered the earl, much more deeply hurt than she imagined. "And therefore they are at an end. I have nothing further to do then but to take my leave." "Good-bye, my lord, good-bye," cried she. "Heaven bless and prosper you!" And with the utmost tranquillity she watched him approach the door. "Now, shall I let him go or not?" said she. "Oh, woman, woman, you are a great fool! Darby, Darby," she added in a soft voice, "come back to your Katrine." Lord Darby turned back and caught her in his arms. "Dear, teasing girl," cried he, why will you strive to wring a heart that loves you?" "Nay, Darby, if things were rightly stated, it is I who have cause to be offended rather than you," answered the lady. "What right had you, sir, to think that the heart of Katrine Bulmer was so base, so mean, as to be changed by the possession of a few paltry counters? Own that you have done me wrong this instant, or I will never forgive you. Down upon your knee, a kneeling confession, or you are condemned beyond hope of grace." Lord Darby was fain to obey his gay lady's behest, and bending his knee, he freely confessed himself guilty of all the crimes she thought proper to charge him withal. In the midst of which, however, he was interrupted by the entrance of an attendant sent by the queen to call Lady Katrine to her presence. The lady laughed and blushed at being found with Lord Darby at her feet, and the earl, not particularly well pleased at the interruption, turned to the usher, saying, with a sort of nonchalant air which he often assumed, "Well, sir, before you go, tell the lady when it was you last found me on my knees to any of the fair dames of the court." "Never, my lord, so please you, that I know of," answered the man, somewhat surprised. "Well, then," rejoined Darby, "next time knock at the door, for fear you should, in which case you might chance to be thrown downstairs by the collar." "Hush, hush, Darby!" cried Lady Katrine. "I must go to her highness. Doubtless we shall not meet again for a long while, so fare you well." And tripping away after the usher, without other adieu, she left her lover to console himself in her absence as best he might. On entering the queen's apartment, she found her royal mistress alone with the king, and, according to the etiquette of the day, was drawing back instantly, when Katherine called her forward. "Come hither, my wild namesake," said the queen. "His grace the king wishes to speak with you. Come near, and answer him all his questions." Lady Katrine advanced, and kneeling on a velvet cushion at Henry's feet, prepared to reply to whatever he might ask, with as much propriety as she could command, although the glad news of the morning had raised her spirits to a pitch of uncontrollable joyousness, which even the presence of the imperious monarch himself could hardly keep within bounds. "Well, my merry mistress," said the king, seeing in her laughing eyes the ebullition of her heart's gladness, "it seems that you do not pine yourself to death for the loss of Sir Osborne Maurice." "I deeply regret, your grace," said Lady Katrine, turning grave for a moment, "most deeply, that Sir Osborne Maurice should have incurred your royal displeasure, for he seemed to me as perfect a knight and as noble a gentleman as I ever saw. but in no other respect do I regret his absence." "Well, we have tried to supply his place with one you may like better," said Henry. "Have you seen the Earl of Derby, ha? What think you of the exchange, pretty one?" "I thank your grace's bounty," said the gay girl. "I have seen his lordship, and looked at him well, and though he be neither so handsome as Narcissus, nor so wise as Solon, he may do well enough for such a giddy thing as I am. Saving your grace's presence, one does not look for perfection in a husband. One might as well hope to find a pippin without a spot." "Thou art a malapert chit, Kate," said the queen, laughing. "Sure I am, if your royal lord was not right gentle in his nature, he would be angry with your wild chattering." "Nay, let her run on," said the king. "A tongue like hers has no guile. If you are contented, sweetheart," he added, addressing Lady Katrine, "that is enough." "Oh yes, quite contented, your grace," answered she. "I have not had a new plaything for so long, that a husband is quite a treat. I suppose he must be sent to the manège first, like the jennet your highness gave me, to learn his places." "If he were as untamed as you are, mistress," answered the king, "he might need it. But to another subject, fair one. You were with Sir Osborne Maurice and his party when he encountered the rioters near Rochester. Some sad treasons are but too surely proved against that luckless young man, yet I would fain believe that his misconduct went not to the extent which was at first reported, especially as the accusation was made by that most ruffianly traitor, Sir Payan Wileton, whom the keen eye of my zealous Wolsey has discovered to be stained with many crimes too black for words to paint. Now, amongst other things, it was urged that this Sir Osborne was in league with those Rochester mutineers, the greatest proof of which was their letting him quietly pass with so small a party, when they boldly attacked the company of Lord Thomas Howard with 10 times the force. Lady Katrine could hardly wait till the king had ceased. "This shows," cried she at length, "how the keenest wisdom and the noblest heart may be abused by a crafty tale. Sir Osborne knew nothing of the rioters, my lord. He took every way to avoid them, because I, unluckily, having neither father nor brother to protect me, encumbered him by my presence. Otherwise, without doubt, he would have delivered the poor priest they had with them by his lance, and not by fair words. Never believe a word of it, your grace. His shield bearer, indeed, while the knight drew up his men to defend us to the best of his power, recognised the leader of the tumultuaries as an old fellow soldier, and craved leave of his lord to go and demand a free passage for us, by which means we escaped. Oh, my lord, as you are famous for your clemency and justice, examine well the whole tale of that Sir Payan Wileton, and it will be found false and villanous, as are all the rest of his actions." "You are eloquent, fair lady," said the king with a smile. "We will tell Darby to look to it. But as to Sir Payan Wileton, his baseness is now known to us; and as we progress down to Dover, we will send a sergeant at arms to bring him with us to Calais, where we will, with our council, hear and judge the whole. Then, if he be the man we think him, not only shall he restore to the old Lord Fitzbernard the lordship of Chilham and the stewardship of Dover, but shall stoop his head to the axe without grace or pardon, as I live. But say, know you aught of Lady Constance de Grey, in whose secrets you are supposed to have had a share? Laugh not, pretty one, for by my life it shall go hard with you if you tell not the truth." "Oh, please, your grace, don't have my head cut off," cried Lady Katrine, seeing, notwithstanding the king's threat, that he was in one of his happier moods. "I never told a lie in my life, except one day, when I said I did not love your highness, and that was when you put off the pageant of the Castle Dolorous till after Pentecost, and I wanted it directly. But on my word, as I hope to be married in a year, and a widow in God's good time, I know no more of where Constance de Grey is, or whither she went, or when, or how, than the child unborn." "Did she ever speak to you thereof, my saucy mistress?" demanded Henry. "You consorted with her much. 'Twere strange if she did not let something fall concerning her purposes, and she a woman too." "I wish I had a secret," said Lady Katrine, half apart, half aloud, "just to show how a woman can keep counsel, if it were but in spite. Good your grace," she continued, "you do not think that Constance would trust her private thoughts to such a light-headed thing as I am. But to set your highness's mind at ease, I vow and protest, by the love and duty I bear to you and my royal mistress, by my conscience, which is tender, and by my honour, which is strong, that I know nothing of Lady Constance de Grey, and that even in my very best imaginings I cannot divine whither she is gone." "Your highness may believe her," said the queen. "Wild as she is, she would not stain her lips with the touch of falsehood, I am sure. Get ye gone, Kate, and hasten your sempstresses, for we shall set out a day before it was intended. And mind you plume up your brightest feathers, for we must outdo the Frenchwomen." "Oh, good your grace! I shall never be ready in time," replied the young lady. "Besides, they tell me I must put on mourning for my 50th cousin by the side of Adam, old Lord Orham, the miser. If I do, it shall be gold crape trimmed with cobwebs, I declare, and so I humbly take my leave of both your graces." Thus saying, she rose from the cushion, dropped a low curtsy to the king and queen, and tripped away to her own apartments. Common bustle and ordinary preparation may be easily imagined. All can, without difficulty, figure to themselves the turmoil preparatory to a ball where there are 6 daughters to marry, with much blood and very little money. The lady mother scolding the housekeeper in her room, and the housekeeper scolding all the servants in hers. A reasonable number of upholsterers, decorators, floor chalkers, confectioners, milliners, much talking to very little purpose, scheming, drilling, and dressing, agitation on the part of the young ladies, and calculation on the part of their mamma, and at the end of a few weeks the matter is done and over. But no mind, however vast may be its powers of conceiving a bustle, can imagine anything like the court of Westminster for the 3 days prior to the king's departure for Canterbury. So continual were the demands upon every kind of artisan, that the impossibility of executing them threw several into despair. One tailor, who is reported to have undertaken to furnish 50 embroidered suits in 3 days, on beholding the mountain of gold and velvet that cumbered his shop-board, saw, like Brutus, the impossibility of victory, and, with Roman fortitude, fell on his own shears. 3 armourers are said to have been completely melted with the heat of their furnaces, and an unfortunate goldsmith swallowed molten silver to escape the persecutions of the day. The road from London to Canterbury was covered during 1 whole week with carts and waggons, mules, horses, and soldiers; and so great was the confusion, that marshals were at length stationed to keep the whole in order, which of course increased the said confusion 100-fold. So many were the ships passing between Dover and Calais, that the historians affirm they jostled each other on the sea, like a herd of great black porkers; and it is known as a fact, that the number of persons collected in the good town of Calais was more than it could lodge, so that not only the city itself, but all the villages round about, were full to overflowing. At length the king set out, accompanied by an immense train, and left London comparatively a desert; while, as he went from station to station, he seemed like a shepherd driving all the better classes of the country before him, and leaving not a single straggler behind. His farther progress, however, was stayed for a time at Canterbury by the news that the Emperor Charles, his wife's nephew, was on the sea before Dover, furnished with the excuse of relationship for visiting the English king, though in reality conducted thither solely by the wish to break the good understanding of the English and French monarchs, or rather to ensure that no treaty contrary to his interest should be negotiated at the approaching meeting. With that we have nothing to do, and it is a maxim which a historian should always follow, never to mind anybody's business but his own. We shall therefore only say, that the king and Wolsey, occupied with the reception of the emperor, and his entertainment during the short time he stayed, forgot entirely Sir Payan Wileton till they reached Dover, when some one happening to call it a chilly morning, put Chilham Castle in Wolsey's head; for on such little pivots turn all the wheels of the world. and immediately a sergeant-at-arms with a body of horse archers was sent to arrest the worthy knight and bring him to Calais, for which port the king and the whole court embarked immediately, and, with a fair wind and fine sky, arrived in safety towards the evening. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. With clouds and storms around thee thrown, tempest on tempest rolled. Thomson. Passing over all the consultations that took place between the Prioress of Richborough, Dr. Wilbraham, and Lady Constance de Grey, regarding the means of crossing the sea to France with greater security, although manifold were the important considerations therein discussed, we shall merely arrive at the conclusion to which they came at length, and which was ultimately determined by the voice of the prioress. This was, that for several days Lady Constance and Mistress Margaret should remain at the convent as nuns, paying a very respectable sum for their board and lodging, while Dr. Wilbraham was to take up his abode at a cottage hard by. By this means, the superior said, they would avoid any search which the cardinal might have instituted to discover them in the vessels of passage between France and England, and at the end of a week they would easily find some foreign ship which would carry them over to Boulogne. Such a one she undertook to procure, by means of a fisherman who supplied the convent, and who, as she boasted, knew every ship that sailed through the Channel, from the biggest man-of-war to the meanest carvel. We shall now leave in silence also the time which Lady Constance passed in the convent. Vonderbrugius, who, as the sagacious reader has doubtless observed, had a most extraordinary partiality for detailing little particulars, and incidents that are of no manner of consequence, here occupies 16 pages with a correct and minute account of every individual day, telling how many masses the nuns sang, how often they fasted in the week, and how often they ate meat; and, not content with relating all that concerned Lady Constance, he indulges in some very illiberal insinuations in regard to the prioress, more than hinting that she loved her bottle and had a pet confessor. Maintaining, however, our grave silence upon this subject, as not only irrelevant but ungentlemanlike, we shall merely say that the days passed tranquilly enough with Lady Constance, although, like the timid creatures of the forest, whom the continual tyranny of the strong over the inoffensive has taught to start even at a sound, she would tremble at every little circumstance which for a moment interrupted the dull calm of the convent solitude. A week passed in this manner, and yet the prioress declared her old fisherman had heard of no vessel that could forward Constance on her journey, though the young lady became uneasy at the delay, and pressed her much to make all necessary inquiries. At length, happening one morning to express her uneasiness to Mistress Margaret, the shrewd waiting-woman, who, with an instinctive sagacity inherent in chambermaids, knew 1,000 times more of the world than either her mistress or Dr. Wilbraham, at once solved the mystery by saying, "Lord love you, lady, there will never be a single ship in the Channel that you will hear of, so long as you pay a gold mark a day to the prioress while we stay." "I would rather give her 100 marks to let me go," replied Constance, "than a single mark to keep me. But what is to be done, Margaret?" "Oh, if you will let me but promise 50 marks, lady," replied the maid, "I will warrant that we are in France in 3 days." Lady Constance willingly gave her all manner of leave and licence, and accordingly that very night Mistress Margaret told the chamberer, under the most solemn vows of secrecy, that her lady intended to give the prioress, as a gift to the convent, 50 golden marks on the day that she took ship. "But," said the abigail, "it cost the poor lady so much, what with paying the chaplain's keep in the cottage, and my wage money, which you know I must have, that her purse is running low, and I fear me she will not be able to do as much for the house as she intends. But mind, you promised to tell no one." "As I hope for salvation, it shall never pass my lips," replied the chamberer, and away she ran to the refectory, where she bound the refectory woman by a most tremendous vow not to reveal the tidings she was about to communicate. The refectory woman vowed with a great deal of facility, and the moment the chamberer was gone, she carried in a jelly to the prioress, where, with a low curtsy and an important whisper, she communicated to the superior the important news. Thereupon the prioress was instantly smitten with a violent degree of anxiety about Lady Constance's escape, and sending down to the fisherman, she commanded him instantly to find a ship going to France. To which the fisherman replied that he knew of no ship going exactly to France, but that there was one lying off the sands, which would doubtless take the lady over for a few broad pieces. Thus were the preliminaries for Constance's escape brought about in a very short space of time, and the fisherman having arranged with the captain that he was to take the lady, the chaplain, and waiting maid to Boulogne for 10 George nobles, early the next morning Lady Constance took leave of the prioress, made her the stipulated present, and, accompanied by the good Dr. Wilbraham and her woman, followed the fisherman to the sands, where his boat waited to convey them to a vessel that lay about a mile from the shore. The sea was calm and tranquil, but to Constance, who had little of a heroine in her nature, it seemed very rough, and every time the boat rose over a wave, she fancied that it must inevitably pitch under the one that followed. However, their passage to the ship was soon over, and as she looked at the high black sides of the vessel, the lady found a greater degree of security in its aspect, imagining it better calculated to battle with the wild waves than the flimsy little bark that had borne her thither. The ship, the fisherman had informed her, was a foreign merchantman, and as she came alongside, 1,000 strange tongues, gabbling all manner of languages, met her ear. It was a floating tower of Babel. In the midst of the confusion and bustle which occurred in getting herself and her companions upon the deck, she saw that one of the sailors attempted to spring from the ship into the boat, but was restrained by those about him, who unceremoniously beat him back with marline spikes and ropes' ends, and for the time she beheld no more of him, though she thought she heard someone uttering invectives and complaints in the English language. For the first few moments after she was on deck, what with the giddiness occasioned by her passage in the boat, and the agitation of getting on board, she could remark nothing that was passing around her, but the moment she had sufficiently recovered to regard the objects by which she was surrounded, a new cause of apprehension presented itself, for close by her side, evidently as commander of the vessel, stood no less distinguished a person than the Portingal captain, of whom honourable mention is made in the first portion of this sage history, and whose proboscis was not easily to be forgot. It was now too late, however, to recede, and her only resource was to draw down her nun's veil, hoping thus to escape being recognised. For some time she had reason to believe that the disguise she had assumed would be effectual with the Portingal, who, as we may remember, had seen her but once; for, occupied in giving orders for weighing anchor and making sail, he took no notice whatever of his fair passenger, and seemed totally to have forgotten her person. But this was not the case. His attention had been first awakened to Lady Constance herself by the sight of Dr. Wilbraham, whose face he instantly remembered, and a slight glance convinced him that the young nun was the bright lady he had seen in Sir Payan's halls. Though there were few of the pleasant little passions which make a man a devil that the worthy Portingal did not possess to repletion, it sometimes happened that one battled against the other, and foiled it in its efforts; but being withal somewhat of a philosopher, after a certain fashion, it was a part of his internal policy, on which he prided himself, to find means of gratifying each of the contending propensities when it was possible, and when it was not possible, to satisfy the strongest with as little offence to the others as might be. In the present instance, he had several important points to consider. Though he felt strongly inclined to carry Lady Constance with him on a voyage which he was about to make to the East Indies, yet there might be danger in the business if the young lady had really taken the veil. Not only danger in case of his vessel being searched by any cruiser he might encounter, but even danger from his own lawless crew, who, though tolerably free from prejudices, still retained a certain superstitious respect for the Church of Rome, and for the things it had rendered sacred, which the worthy captain had never been able to do away with. This consideration would have deterred him from any evil attempt upon the fair girl, whom he otherwise seemed to hold completely in his power, had it not been for the additional incentive of the 2 large leathern bags which had been committed into his charge at the same time with the young lady, and which, by the relation of their size to their weight, he conceived must contain a prize of some value. Determined by this, he gave orders for making all sail down the channel, and the ship being fairly under way, he could no longer resist the temptation which the opportunity presented of courting the good graces of his fair passenger. Approaching then, with an air of what he conceived mingled dignity and sweetness, his head swinging backwards and forwards on the end of his long neck, and his infinite nose protruded like a pointer's when he falls upon the game. "Ah, my very pretty gal!" cried he. "You see you be obliged to have recourse to me at last." "My good friend," said Dr. Wilbraham, struggling with the demon of sea-sickness, which had grasped him by the stomach and was almost squeezing his soul out, "you had better let the lady alone, for she is so sick that she cannot attend to you, though, doubtless, you mean to be civil in your way." "You go to the devil, Master Chaplain," replied the captain, "and preach to him's imps. I say, my very pretty mistress, suppose you were to pull up this dirty black veil and show your charming face." And he drew aside the young lady's veil in spite of her efforts to hold it down. At the helm, not far from where the young lady sat, stood a sturdy seaman, who, by his clear blue eye, fresh weather-beaten countenance, and bluff unshrinking look, one might easily have marked out as an English sailor. Leaning on the tiller by which he was steering the vessel on her course, he had marked his worthy captain's conduct with a sort of contemplative frown; but when, stooping down, the Portingallo tore away Lady Constance's veil, and amused himself by staring in her face, the honest sailor stretched out his foot and touched him on a protuberant part of his person which presented itself behind. The captain, turning sharply round, eyed him like a demon, but the Englishman stood his glance with a look of steady, nonchalant resolution, that it was not easy to put down. "I say, Portingallo," said he, "do you want me to heave you overboard?" "You heave me overboard, you mutinous thief!" cried the captain. "I'll have you strung up to the yard arm, you vaggle-boned, I will." "You'll drown a little first, by the nose of the Tinker of Ashford," replied the other. "But hark you, Portingallo, let the young lady nun alone, or, as I said before, by the nose of the Tinker of Ashford, I'll heave you overboard, and then I'll make the crew a ration, and tell them what a good service I've done 'em. And I'll lay down the matter in 3 heads. First, as you were a rascal; second, as you were a villain; and third, as you were a blackguard. Then I will show how first you did wrong to a passenger, second, how you did wrong to a lady, and third, how you did wrong to a nun. For the first you deserve to be flogged, for the second you deserve to be kicked, and for the third you are devilish likely to be hanged, with time and God's blessing." For a moment or two the Portingallo was somewhat confounded by the eloquence of the Englishman, who was in fact no other than Timothy Bradford, the chief of the Rochester rioters. Recovering himself speedily, however, he retaliated pretty warmly, yet did not dare to come to extremities with his rebellious steersman, as Bradford, having taken refuge in his vessel, with 4 or 5 of his principal associates, commanded too strong a party on board to permit very strict discipline. It was a general rule of the amiable captain never to receive 2 men that, to his knowledge, had ever seen one another before; but several severe losses in his crew had, in the present instance, driven him into an error, which he now felt bitterly, not being half so much master of his own wickedness as he used to be before. Nevertheless, he did not fail to express his opinion of the helmsman's high qualities in no very measured terms, threatening a great deal more than he dared perform, of which both parties were well aware. "Come, come, Portingallo," cried the helmsman, "you know very well what is right as well as another, and I say you shan't molest the lady. Another thing, master, you treat that poor lubberly Jekin like a brute, and I'll not see it done, so look to it. But I'll tell you what, captain, let us mind what we are about. These dark clouds that are gathering there to leeward, and coming up against the wind, mean something. Better take in sail." The effect of this conversation was to free Constance from the persecution of the captain, and turning her eyes in the direction to which the sailor pointed, she saw, rolling up in the very face of the wind, some heavy leaden clouds, tipped with a lurid reddish hue wherever they were touched by the sun. Above their heads, and to windward, the sky was clear and bright, obscured by nothing but an occasional light cloud that flitted quickly over the heaven, drawing after it a soft shadow that passed like an arrow over the gay waves, which all around were dancing joyously in the sunshine. By this time the English coast was becoming fainter and more faint, the long line of cliffs and headlands massing together, covered with an airy and indistinct light, while the shores of France seemed growing out of the waters, with heavy piles of clouds towering above them, and seeming to advance, with menacing mien, towards the rocks of England. Still, though the eye might mark them rolling over one another in vast dense volumes, looking fit receptacles for the thunder and the storm, the clouds seemed to make but little progress, contending with the opposing wind, while mass after mass, accumulating from beyond, appeared to bring up new force to the dark front of the tempest. Still the ship sped on, and, the wind being full in her favour, made great way through the water, so that it was likely they would reach Boulogne before the storm began, and the captain, now obliged to abandon any evil purpose he might have conceived towards Lady Constance, steered towards the shore of France to get rid of her as soon as possible. From time to time every eye on board was turned towards the lowering brow of heaven, and then always dropped to the French coast, to ascertain how near was the tempest and how far the haven; and Constance, not sufficiently sick to be heedless of danger, ceased not to watch the approaching clouds and the growing shore with alternate hope and fear. Gradually the hills towards Boulogne, the cliffs and the sands, with dark lines of tower, and wall, and citadel, and steeple, began to grow more and more distinct, and the Portingal was making a tack to run into the harbour, when the vane at the masthead began to quiver, and in a moment after turned suddenly round. Cries and confusion of every sort succeeded. One of the sails was completely rent to pieces, and the ship received such a sudden shock that Constance was cast from her seat upon the deck, and poor Dr. Wilbraham rolled over, and almost pitched out at the other side. Soon, however, the yards were braced round, the vessel was put upon another tack, and from a few words that passed between the captain and the steersman, Constance gathered that as they could not get into Boulogne, they were about to run for Whitesand Haven at the nearest port. "Go down below, lady, go down below and tell your beads," cried the steersman, as he saw Constance sitting and holding herself up by the binnacle. "Here, Jekey, help her down." "Lord a mercy, we shall all be drowned, I am sure we shall," cried our old friend Jekin Groby, coming forward, transformed into the likeness of a bastard sailor, his new profession sitting upon him with inconceivable awkwardness, and the Kentish clothier shining forth in every movement of his inexpert limbs. "Lord a mercy upon us! We shall all be drowned, as sure as possible. Mistress Nun, let me help you down below. It's more comfortable to be drowned downstairs, they say. There's a flash of lightning, I declare. Mercy upon us! We shall all go to the bottom. This is the worst storm I've seen since that Portingallo vagabond kidnapped me, by the help of the devil and Sir Payan Wileton. Let me help you down below, Mistress Nun. Lord bless you, it's no trouble. I'm going down myself." Constance, however, preferred staying upon deck, where she could watch the progress of their fate, to remaining below in a state of uncertainty, and consequently resisted the honest persuasions of good Jekin Groby, who, finding her immovable, slipped quietly below unobserved, and hid himself in an empty hammock, courageously making up his mind to be drowned, if he could but be drowned asleep. In the meantime, the storm began to grow more vehement, the wind coming in quick, violent gusts, and the clouds spreading far and wide over the face of the sky, with a threatening blackness of hue, and heavy slowness of flight, that menaced their instant descent. As yet, no second flash of lightning had succeeded the first, and no drop of rain had fallen, and though the ship laboured violently with the waves, excited into tumult by the sudden change of wind, still running on, she seemed in a fair way of reaching white sand in safety. Presently another bright flash blazed through the sky, and seemed to rend it from the horizon to the zenith, while instant upon the red path of its fiery messenger roared forth the voice of the thunder, as if it would annihilate the globe. Another now succeeded, and another, till the ear and the eye were almost deafened by the din and blinded by the light, while slow, large drops came dripping from the heavens, like tears wrung by agony from a giant's eyes. Then came a still and death-like pause. The thunder ceased, the wind hushed, and the only sounds that met the ear were the rushing of the waves by the ship's side, and the pattering of each big raindrop as it fell on the deck, while a small sea-bird kept wheeling round the vessel and screaming, as with a sort of fiendish joy, to see it labouring with the angry billows. Soon again, however, did the storm begin with redoubled fury, and the lightnings flashed more vividly than ever, covering all the sky with broad blue sheets of light, while still in the midst of the whole blaze appeared a narrow zigzag line of fire, so bright that it made the rest look pale. Still Constance kept upon the deck, and drawing her hood over her head, strove to fix herself, amidst the pitching of the vessel, by clinging to the binnacle, which in ships of that day was often supported by a couple of oblique bars. Seeing, in a momentary cessation of the storm, the eye of the steersman fixed upon her with a look of somewhat like pity, she ventured to ask if they were in much danger. "Danger? Bless you, no, lady," cried the man. "Only a little thunder and lightning. No danger in life. But you had better go below. There's no danger." As he spoke, another bright flash caused Constance to close her eyes, but a tremendous crash, which made itself audible even through the roar of the thunder, as well as a heavy roll of the vessel, gave her notice that the lightning had struck somewhere, and looking up, to her horror she beheld the mainmast shivered almost to atoms by the lightning, and rolled over the ship's side, to which it was still attached by a mass of blazing cordage. "Cut! Cut! Cut!" vociferated the steersman, amidst the unavailing shouts and bustling inactivity of the crew. "Cut, you Portingallo vagabonds! You'll have the ship on fire. The idiots are staring as if they never saw such a thing before. Here, captain, take the helm." "Damn you to hell! Take the helm!" And springing forward with the energy to which the danger of the moment seemed to lend additional impulse, he scattered the frightened Portuguese and impassive Dutchmen, who were uncluing ropes and disentangling knots, and catching up a hatchet, soon cut sheer through the thicker rigging, and with a roll the blazing remnants of the mast pitched into the sea, leaving nothing on fire behind but some scattered cordage, which the Englishman and his companions gradually extinguished. In the meanwhile, the mast, still flaming in the water, swung round the ship, and the Portingallo, whose presence of mind did not seem of the very first quality, brought the vessel's head as near the wind as possible, to let it drift astern, and thus, by this lubberly action, bore right upon the shore, carried on imperceptibly by the strong current. At that moment the Englishman raised himself, and looking out ahead, vociferated, "A reef! A reef! Breakers ahead! Down with the helm! Where the devil are you going? Down with the helm, I say!" And rushing forward, he seized the tiller, but too late. Scarcely had he touched it with his hand, when with a tremendous shock the ship struck on the reef, making her very seams open and her masts stagger. "Ho! Down in the hold! Down in the hold! Heave all the ballast aft!" cried Bradford. "Lay those cannon here! Bring her head to wind! Let her take aback, if it will. She may swing off yet." But just then an immense swelling wave heaved the ship up like a cork, and dashed her down again upon the hidden rocks without hope or resource. Every one caught at what was next him for support, for the jar was so great that it was hardly possible for even the sailors to keep upon their feet. But the next minute the ship became more steady, and a harsh grating sound succeeded, as if the hard angles of the rock were tearing the bottom of the ship to pieces. Every one now occupied himself in a different way. Bradford sat quietly down by the tiller, which he abandoned to its own guidance, while the Portingal ran whispering among his countrymen, who as speedily and silently as possible got the boat to the ship's side. In the meanwhile, Dr. Wilbraham crept over to Lady Constance, who, turning her meek eyes to heaven, seemed to await her fate with patient resignation. "I need not ask you, my dear child," said the good man, "if you be prepared to go. Have you anything to say to me before we part? Soon, I hope, to meet again where no storms come." "But little," answered Constance, and according to the rite of her church, she whispered all the little faults that memory could supply, accusing herself of many things as sins which few but herself would have held as even errors. When he had heard the lady's confession, the clergyman turned to look for the waiting woman to join her with her mistress in the consolations of religion. But Mistress Margaret, who greatly preferred the present to the future, was no longer there, and looking forward, they saw that the Portuguese and Dutch had got out the boats, and were pouring in fast. But that which most astonished them was to find that the selfish waiting woman had by some means got the very first place in the long boat, from which the captain was striving to exclude two of the Englishmen, pushing off from the ship with the boat-hook. The lesser boat, however, was still near, and Dr. Wilbraham looked at Constance with an inquiring glance. But Bradford, who had never stirred from his position, interposed, saying, "Don't go, lady, don't go. Stick to the ship. She can't sink, for the tide is near flood, and we are now aground, and it may be a while before she goes to pieces. Those boats can never live through that surf, so don't go, lady. Take my advice, and I'll manage to save you yet, if I can save myself." Even as he spoke, the two Englishmen made a desperate jump to leap into the lesser boat, which was pulling away after the other. One man fell too short and sank instantly. The other got hold of the gunwale and strove to clamber in, but the boat was already too full, and a sea striking it at the moment, his weight put it out of trim. It shipped a heavy sea, settled for a moment, and sank before their eyes. It was a dreadful sight, and yet so deep, so exciting was the interest, that even after she had seen the whole 10 persons sink, and some rise again, only to be overwhelmed by another wave, Constance could not take her eyes off the other boat, although she expected every moment to see it share the fate of its companion. Still, however, it rode on. The thunder had ceased, the wind was calmer, and the waves seemed less agitated. There was hope that it might reach the shore. At that moment it was hidden for an instant below a wave, rose again, entered the surf, disappeared amidst the foam and spray. Constance looked to see it rise again, but it never was seen more, and in a few minutes she could distinguish a dark figure scramble out from the sea upon the shore, rise, fall again, lie for a moment as if exhausted, and then, once more gaining his feet, ran with all speed out of the way of the coming waves. "Oh dear, oh dear!" cried a dolorous voice from below. "We shall all be drowned for a sure certainty. The waters are coming in like mad." And in a moment after, the head, and then the body of honest Jekin Groby, protruded itself from the hold, with strong signs and tokens in his large thick eyelids of having just awoke from a profound sleep. "Lord a mercy!" continued him, seeing the nearly empty deck. "Where are all the folks? Oh, Master Bradford, we are in a bad way. The water has just awoke me out of my sleep. What's the meaning of that thumping? Lord's a mercy, where's the Portingal?" "Drowned," answered Bradford calmly, "and every one of his crew, except Hinchin, the strong swimmer, who has gone to land." "Lord a mercy, only think!" cried Jekin. "Must I be drowned too? Hadn't I better jump over? I can swim a little too. Shall I jump over, Master Bradford? Pray tell me, there's a good creature." "No, no, stay where you are," replied Bradford. "Help me to lash this young lady to a spar. When the tide turns, which will be at 4 o'clock, that surf will go down, and the ship will keep together till then. Most likely Hinchin would send a boat before that to take us all off. If not, we can but trust to the water at last. However, let us all be ready." Bradford now brought forth from the hold some rough planks, to one of which he lashed Lady Constance, who yielded herself to his guidance, only praying that he would do the same good turn to the clergyman, which he promised willingly. He then tied a small piece of wood across to support her head, and fastened one of the heavy leathern bags to her feet, to raise her face above the water; after which, as she was totally unable to move, he placed her in as easy a position as he could, and speaking a few frank words of comfort and assurance, he left her to perform the same office in favour of Dr. Wilbraham. In the meantime, Jekin Groby had not forgotten himself, but willing to put his faith rather in the buoyancy of deal boards than in his own powers of natation, had contrived to find a stout sort of packing case or wooden box, from which he knocked out both the top and bottom, and passing his feet through the rest, he raised it up till it reached his armpits, where he tied it securely; and thus equipped in his wooden girdle, as he called it, he did not fear to trust himself to the waves. All being now prepared, an hour or more of anxious expectation succeeded. Little was said by any one, and the tempest had ceased, but the grounding sound of the ship fretting upon the rock still continued, and a sad creaking and groaning of the two masts that remained seemed to announce their speedy fall. The wind had greatly subsided, but the air was heated and close, while the clouds overhead, still agitated by the past storm, every now and then came down in thick small rain. Towards 4 o'clock the tide turned, and, as Bradford had prognosticated, the surf upon the shore gradually subsided, and the sea became more smooth, though agitated by a heavy swell, foaming into breakers along the whole line of reef on which the ship had struck. After looking out long, in the vain hope of seeing some boat coming to their assistance, Bradford approached Lady Constance, and addressing her, as indeed he had done throughout, with far more gentleness and consideration than might have been expected from a man of his rough and turbulent character, "Lady," said he, "there seems to be no chance of a boat. The sea is now nearly smooth. I can't warrant that the ship will hold together all night, and we may have the storm back again. If you like to go now, I will get you safe to land, I am sure. I can't answer for it if you stay." "I will do as you think right," said Lady Constance, with an involuntary shudder at the thought of trusting herself to the mercy of the waves. "I will do as you think right, but pray take care of Dr. Wilbraham." "No, no," said the good chaplain. "Make the lady all your care. I shall do well enough." "Here, good fellow," said Constance, taking a diamond of price from her finger. "Perhaps you may reach the shore without either of us. However, whether you do or not, take this jewel as some recompense for your good service." The man took the ring, muttering that, if he reached the shore, she should reach it too; and then, after giving some directions to Dr. Wilbraham in regard to rowing himself on towards the land with his arms, which were free, he carried Lady Constance to the side of the vessel, which had now heeled almost to the water's edge. Returning for Dr. Wilbraham, with the assistance of Jekin, he brought him also to the side, and then it became the question who should be the first to trust himself to the waves. Constance trembled violently, but said not a word, while Jekin Groby, holding back, exclaimed, "Lord a mercy, I don't like it, at all like." It was upon him, however, that Bradford fixed, crying, "Come, jump over, Jeky. There's no use of making mouths at it. I want you to help the clerk to steer. Come, jump over." And he laid his hand upon his shoulder. "Well, well, I will, Master Bradford," cried Jekin. "Then she touch me, and I will. Oh dear, it's mighty disagreeable. Well, well, I will." And bending his hams, he made as if he would have taken a vigorous leap; but his courage failed him, and he only made a sort of hop of a few inches on the deck, without approaching any nearer to the water. Out of patience, Bradford caught him by the shoulder, and pushed him at once head foremost into the water, from which he rose in a moment, all panting, buoyed up by the wooden case under his arms. "Here, Jeekie," cried Bradford, "take the doctor's feet, as your arms are free." And with the assistance of the worthy clothier, who bore no malice, he let down Dr. Wilbraham into the water and returned to the lady. As pale as death, Constance shut her eyes and held her breath, while the rough sailor took her in his arms, and let her glide slowly into the water, which, in a moment after, she felt dashing round her uncontrolled. Opening her eyes, and panting for breath, she stretched out her arms, almost deprived of consciousness. But at that moment Bradford jumped at once into the sea, and seizing the board to which she was tied, put it in its right position, so that, though many a domineering wave would rise above its fellows, and dash its salt foam over her head, her mouth was generally elevated above the water sufficiently to allow her full room to breathe. The distance of the ship from the land was about 1/4 of a mile, but between it and the shore lay a variety of broken rocks, raising their rough heads above the waves that dashed furiously amongst them, making 1,000 struggling whirlpools and eddies round their sharp angles, as the retiring sea withdrew its unwilling waters from the strand. Constance, however, did not see all this, for, her face being turned towards the sky, nothing met her sight but the changeable face of heaven, with the clouds hurrying over it, or the green billows on either side, threatening every moment to overwhelm her. Often, often did her heart sink, and hard was it for the spirit of a timid girl, even supported by her firm trust in God's mercy, to keep the spark of hope alive within her bosom, while looking on the perils that surrounded her, and fancying 1,000 that she did not behold. Still the stout seaman swam beside her, piloting the little raft he had made for her towards the shore. Through all the difficulties of the navigation, which were not few or small, for the struggle between the retiring tide and the impetus given by the wind rendered almost every passage between the rocks a miniature Scylla and Charybdis. At length, however, choosing a moment when the waves flowed fully in between two large rough stones, whose heads protruded almost perpendicularly, he grasped the plank to which Constance was tied with his left hand, and striking a few vigorous strokes with his right, soon placed her within the rocky screen with which the coast was fenced, and within whose boundary the water was comparatively calm. The first object that presented itself to his sight within this haven was the long-boat, keel upwards, while, tossed by the waves upon one of the large flat stones that the ebbing tide had left half bare, appeared the corpse of the Portingal captain, his feet and body on the rock, and his head drooping back, half covered by the water. In a minute after, the sailor's feet could touch the ground, and gladly availing himself of the power to walk upon terra firma, he waded on, drawing after him the plank on which Constance lay, till, reaching the dry land, he pulled her to the shore, cut the cord that tied her, and placed her on her feet. Constance's first impulse was to throw herself on her knees, and to thank God for his great mercy. Her next to express her gratitude to the honest sailor, who, weary and out of breath with his exertion, sat on a rock hard by. But bewildered with all that had passed, she could scarcely find words to speak, feeling herself in a world that seemed hardly her own, so near had she been to the brink of another. After a few confused sentences, she looked suddenly round, exclaiming, "Oh, where is Dr. Wilbraham?" The sailor started up, and getting on the rock, looked out beyond, where, about 200 yards off, he perceived honest Jekin Groby making his way towards the shore in one direction, while the plank to which the amiable clergyman was attached was seen approaching the rocks in another, at a point where the waters were boiling with tenfold violence. Constance's eye had already caught his long black habiliments, mingled with the white foam of the waves, and seeing that every fresh billow threatened to dash him to pieces against the stones, she clasped her hands in agony, and looked imploringly towards the sailor. "He will have his brains dashed out, sure enough," said the man, watching him. "Zounds, he must be mad to try that. Stay here, lady, I will see what can be done." And rushing into the water, he waded as far as he could towards Dr. Wilbraham, and then once more began swimming. Constance watched him with agonizing expectation, but before he reached the point, An angry wave swept round the good old man, and raising him high upon its top, dashed him violently against the rock. Constance shuddered, and clasping her hands over her eyes, strove to shut out the dreadful sight. In a few minutes she heard the voice of the sailor shouting to Jekin Groby, who had reached the shore, "Here, lend a hand!" and looking up, she saw him drawing the clergyman to land in the same manner that he had extricated herself. Jekin Groby waded in to help him, and Constance flew to the spot which he approached, but the sight that presented itself made her blood run cold. Dr. Wilbraham was living indeed, but so dreadfully torn and bruised by beating against the rocks, that all hope seemed vain, and those who had best loved him might have regretted that he had not met with a speedier and more easy death. Opening his exhausted eyes, he yet looked gladly upon the sweet girl that he had reared, like a young flower, from her early days to her full beauty, and who now hung tenderly over him. "Thank God, my dear child," said he, "that you are safe. That is the first thing. For me, I am badly hurt, very badly hurt, but perhaps I may yet live. I could wish it to see you happy, but if not, God's will be done." Constance wept bitterly, and good Jekin Groby, infected with her sorrow, blubbered like a great baby. "There, leave off snivelling, you great fool," cried Bradford, wiping something like a tear from his own rough cheek, "and help me to carry the good gentleman to some cottage." Thus saying, with the assistance of Jekin, he raised the old man, and, followed by Constance, bore him on in search of an asylum. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. Thou seest me much distempered in my mind. Dryden. Sir Payan Wileton had gone through life with fearless daring, calculating but never hesitating, keen-sighted of danger but never timid. From youth he had divested himself of the three great fears which generally affect mankind: the fear of the world's opinion, the fear of his own conscience, and the fear of death. And thus endued with much bad courage, he had attempted and succeeded in many things which would have frightened a timid man, and failed with an irresolute one. And yet, as we have seen, by one of those strange contradictions of which human nature is full, Sir Payan, though an unbeliever in the bright truths of religion, was credulous to many of the darkest superstitions of the age in which he lived. On such a mind, anything that smacked of supernatural presentiment was likely to take the firmest hold, and on the morning after Lady Constance had, by his means and by his instigation, effected her flight from Richmond, he rose early from a troubled sleep, overshadowed by a deep despondency, which had never till then hung upon him. Before he was yet dressed, the news was brought him that one of his men had returned with the boat, and that the other had been arrested in the king's name. He felt his good fortune had passed away. An internal voice seemed to tell him that it was at an end, but yet he omitted no measures of security, quitting the capital without loss of time, and leaving such instructions with the porter as he deemed most likely to blind the eyes of Wolsey, hoping that the servant, whose life was in his power, would not betray him, yet prepared, if he did, boldly to repel the charge, and by producing evidence to invalidate the other's testimony, to cast the accusation back upon his head. But still, from that moment, Sir Payan was an altered being, and though many days passed by without anything occurring to disturb his repose, though the king's progress towards Dover, without any notice having been taken of his participation in Lady Constance's escape, led him to believe that fear had kept the servant faithful, yet still Sir Payan remained in a state of gloom and lassitude that raised many a marvel amongst those around him. Wandering through the woods that surrounded his mansion, he passed hours and hours in deep, inactive, bitter meditation, finding no consolation in his own heart, no hope in the future, and no repose in the past, and, why he knew not, despairing where he had never despaired, trembling where he had never known fear. Often he questioned himself upon the strange depression of his mind, and the more he did so, the more he became convinced that it was a supernatural warning of approaching fate. Many were the resolutions that he made to shake it off, to struggle still, to seek the court, and urge his claim on the estates of Constance de Grey, as he would have done in former days, but in vain. A leaden power lay heavy upon his heart, and crushed all its usual energies, and the only effort he could make was to send out servants in every direction to seek Sir Cesar the astrologer, weakly hoping to brace up his relaxed confidence by some predictions of success. But the old man was not easily to be found. No one knew his abode, and, ever strange and erratic in his motions, he seemed now agitated by some extraordinary impulse, so that even when they had once found his track, the servants of Sir Payan had often to trace him to 10 or 12 houses in the course of a day. Sometimes it was in the manor of the peer, sometimes in the cottage of the peasant, that they heard of him, but in none did he seem to sojourn for above an hour, hurrying on wildly to the dwelling of some other amongst the many that he knew in all classes. At length they overtook him on the road near Sandgate, and delivered Sir Payan's message, whereupon, without any reply, he turned his horse and rode towards Chilham, where he arrived in the evening. Springing to the ground without any appearance of fatigue, the old man sought Sir Payan in the park, to which the servant said he had retired, and, winding through the various long valleys, found him at length walking backwards and forwards, with his arms crossed on his bosom, and his eyes fixed upon the ground. The evening sunshine was streaming brightly upon the spot, pouring a mellow misty light through the western trees, on the tall dark figure of Sir Payan, who, bending down his head, paced along with gloomy slowness, like some bad spirit oppressed and tormented by the smile of heaven. It was a strange sight to see his meeting with Sir Cesar. Both were pale and haggard, for some cause only known to himself had worn the keen features of the astrologer till the bones and cartilages seemed starting through the skin, and Sir Payan's ashy cheek had lately acquired a still more deadly hue than it usually wore. Both, too, looked wild and fearful, the keen black eyes of the old man showing with a terrific brightness in his thin and livid face, and the stern features of Sir Payan appearing full of a sort of ferocious light, which the attendants had remarked ever since he had been overthrown in the tilt by the lance of Sir Osborne. Meeting thus in the full yellow sunshine, while Sir Cesar fixed his usual intense and scrutinizing glance upon the countenance of the other, Sir Payan strove to receive him with a smile that but mocked the lips it shone upon. They looked like two beings of another world, met for the first time in upper air, to commune of things long past. "Well, unhappy man," said Sir Cesar at length, "what seekest thou with me?" "That I am unhappy," replied Sir Payan, knitting his brow, as he saw that little consolation was to be expected from the astrologer, "I do not deny; and it is to know why I am unhappy that I have asked you to come hither." "You are unhappy," answered Sir Cesar, "because you have plundered the widow and the orphan, because you have wronged the friendless and the weak, because you have betrayed the confident and the generous. You are unhappy because there is not one in the wide world that loves you, and because you even despise and hate and reprobate yourself." "Old man!" cried Sir Payan, half unsheathing his dagger, "beware, beware! Those men only," he added, pushing back the weapon into its sheath, "ought to be unhappy that are unsuccessful. The rest is all a bugbear set up by the weak to frighten away the strong. But I have been successful, am successful. Why, then, am I unhappy?" "Because your success is at an end," replied the astrologer; "because you tremble to your fall; because your days are numbered, and late remorse is gnawing your heart in spite of your vain boasting. Nay, lay not your hand on the hilt of your dagger. Over me, murderer, you have no power. That dagger took the life of one that had never wronged you. Remember the rout at Taunton. Remember the youth murdered the night after he surrendered." Sir Payan trembled like an aspen leaf while the old man spoke. "Yes, murderer," cried Sir Cesar. "Though you thought the deed hid in the bowels of the earth, I know it all. That hand slew all that was dearest to me on earth, the child that unhappy fortune forced me to leave upon this cursed shore, and long, long ago should his fate have been avenged in your blood, had I not seen, had I not known, that heaven willed it otherwise. I have waited patiently for the hour that is now come. I have broken your bread, and I have drunk of your wine, but while I did so, I have seen you gathering curses on your head, and accumulating sins to sink you to perdition, and that has taught me to endure. I would not have saved you 1 hour of crime. I would not have robbed my revenge of one single sin. No, not for an empire. But I have watched you go on, gloriously, triumphantly, in evil and in wickedness, till heaven can bear no more, till you have eaten up your future, and soon, with all your crimes upon your head, hated, despised, condemned by all mankind, your black soul shall be parted from your body, and my eyes shall see you die." Sir Payan had listened with varied emotions as the old man spoke. Surprise, remorse, and fear had been the first, but gradually the more tempestuous feelings of his nature hurried away the rest, and rage gaining mastery over all, he drew his poniard and sprang upon Sir Cesar. But in the very act, as his arm was raised to strike, he was caught by 2 powerful men, who threw him back upon the ground and disarmed him, one of them exclaiming, "Ho, ho, we have just come in time. Sir Payan Wileton, you are attached in the king's name. Lo, here is a warrant for your apprehension. You must come with us, sir, to Calais." One would attempt in vain to describe the rage that convulsed the form of Sir Payan Wileton, more especially when he beheld Sir Cesar smile upon him with a look of triumphant satisfaction. "Seize him!" exclaimed he, with furious violence, pointing to the astrologer. "Seize him, if you love your king and your country. He is a marked and obnoxious traitor. I impeach him, and you do not do your duty if you let him escape. Or are you his confederates, and come up to prevent my punishing him for the treasons he has just acknowledged?" "Sir Payan Wileton," replied the sergeant at arms, "this passion is all in vain. I am sent here with a warrant from the king's privy council to attach you for high treason, but I have no authority to arrest any one else." "But I am a magistrate," cried the baffled knight. "Let him not escape, I enjoin you, till I have had time to commit him. He is a traitor, I say, and if you seize him not, you art the king's enemies." "Attached for high treason, sir, you are no longer a magistrate," replied the sergeant. "At all events, I do not hold myself justified in apprehending anybody against whom I have no warrant, more especially when I found you raising your hand illegally against the very person's life whom you now accuse. I can take no heed of the matter. You must come." "He shall be satisfied," said Sir Cesar. "Venomless serpent, I will follow thee now till thy last hour; but think not that thou canst hurt me, for thy power has gone from thee, and though wicked as a demon, thou art weak as a child. I know that we are doomed to pass the same gate, but not to journey on the same road. Lead on, sergeant, I will go on with you, and then, if this bad man have aught to urge against me, let him do it." "Go if you will, sir," replied the officer; "but remember, you act according to your own pleasure. I make no arrest in your case. You are free to come with us, or to stay, as you think fit." Sir Payan was now led back to the house, which was in possession of the king's archers; and as he passed through his own hall with a burning heart, the hasty glance that he cast around amongst his servants showed him at once that though there were none to pity or befriend, there were many full ready to betray. Then rushed upon his mind the accusations that they might pile upon his head, now that they saw him sinking below the stream. The certainty of death, the dread of something after death, doubts of his own scepticism, the innate, all-powerful conviction of a future state, a state growing dreadfully perceptible to his eye as he approached the brink of that yawning gulf which his own acts had peopled with strange fears. All that he had scoffed at, all that he had despised, now assumed a new and fearful character. Even the world's opinion, the world's contemned opinion, came across his thought, that there was not one heart on all the earth would mourn his end, that hatred and abhorrence would go with him to the grave, and that his memory would only live with infamy in the records of crime and punishment. Burying his face in his hands, he sat in deep, despairing, agonizing silence while his horse was being prepared, and while the officer put his seal upon the various doors which he thought it necessary to secure. A few hours brought the whole party to Dover, and the next day saw their arrival at Calais. But by that time the court had removed to Guisnes, and the sergeant, having no orders to bring his prisoner farther, sent forward a messenger to announce his arrival and demand instructions. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. Once more the fleeting soul came back t'inspire the mortal frame, and in the body took a doubtful stand, hovering like expiring flame, that mounts and falls by turns. Dryden. The painful situation of Lady Constance de Grey had not lost any portion of its sorrow, or gained any ray of hope, on the 1st of June, 3 days after we last left her, at which period we again take up her story. She was then sitting in a small, poor cottage between Whitesand Bay and Boulogne, watching the slumber of the excellent old man whose regard for her had brought upon his head so much pain and danger. Ever since he had been removed to the hut where they now were, he had lingered in great agony, except at those times when a state of stupor fell upon him, under which he would remain for many hours, and only wake from it again to acute pain. He had, however, that morning fulfilled the last duties of his religion, with the assistance of a good monk of Boulogne, who now sat with Lady Constance, watching the sweet sleep into which he had fallen for the first time since their shipwreck. Across the little window, to keep out the light, Constance had drawn one of her own dresses, which had been saved by the sailor Bradford, having tied the leathern case that contained them to the plank which had brought herself to shore. But still through the casement, notwithstanding this sort of extemporaneous curtain, the soft breath of the early morning flowed in, and the murmuring voice of the treacherous ocean was heard softly from afar, filling up every pause in the singing of the birds and the busy hum of all the light children of the summer. The calmness of the old man's slumber gave Constance hope, and with a sweet smile she sat beside him, listening to the mingled voice of creation, and joining mentally in the song of praise that all things seemed raising towards the great Creator. Indeed, if ever mortal being might be supposed to resemble those pure spirits who, freed from all touch of clay, adore the Almighty in his works, she then looked like an angel, in form, in feature, and in expression, while, robed all in white, and watching the sick-bed of her ancient friend, she looked upon his tranquil slumber with that bland smile of hope and gratitude. In the meanwhile, the old monk sat on the other side of his bed, regarding him with more anxiety. For long experience in visiting those who hung on the brink of another world had taught him that sleep like that into which the clergyman had fallen as often precedes death as recovery. It had continued thus till towards midday, the cottage being left in solitude and silence, for the sailor Bradford had gone to seek remedies from a simpler at Boulogne, and Jekin Groby had stolen away for a visit to Calais, while the people to whom the cottage belonged were absent upon their daily occupations. At length, however, a slight sort of convulsive motion passed over the features of the old man, and, opening his eyes, he said in a faint, low voice, "Constance, my dear child, where are you? My eyes are dim." "I am here, my dear sir," replied Constance. You have been sleeping very sweetly. I hope you feel better." "It is over, Constance," replied Dr. Wilbraham, calmly but feebly. "I am dying, my child. Let me see the sunshine." Constance withdrew the curtain, and the fresh air blowing on to the sick man's face seemed to give him more strength. "It is bright," cried he. "It is very bright. I feel the sweet summer air, and I hear the glad singing of the birds. But I go fast, dear daughter, where there are things brighter and sweeter. For surely, surely, God who has clothed this world with such splendour has reserved far greater for the world to come." The tears streamed down Constance's cheeks, for there was in the old man's face a look of death not to be mistaken. That look, the inevitable precursor of dissolution to man, when it seems as if the avenging angel has come between him and the sun of being, and cast his dark shadow over him for ever. "Weep not, Constance," said the old man, with faint and broken efforts, "for no storm will reach me in my Redeemer's bosom. In his mercy is my hope, in his salvation is my reliance. Soon, soon shall I be in the place of peace, where joy reigneth eternally. Could I have a fear, my dear child, it would be for you, left alone in a wide and desolate world, with none to protect you. But no, I have no fear. God is your protector, and never, never, my child, doubt his goodness, nor think that he does not as surely watch over the universe as he that created it at first. Everything is beneath his eye, from the smallest grain of sand to the great globe itself, and his will governs all and guides all, though we see neither the beginning nor the end. Constance, I am departing," he continued more faintly. "God's blessing upon you, my child; and oh, if he in his wisdom ever permits the spirit of the dead to watch over those they loved when living, I will be with you and Darnley when this frail body is dust." His lips began gradually to lose their power of utterance, and his head fell back upon the pillow. The monk saw that the good man's end was approaching fast, and placing the crucifix in his dying hand, he poured the words of consolation in his ear. But Dr. Wilbraham slightly motioned with his hand to signify that he was quite prepared, and fixing his eyes upon the cross, murmured to himself, "I come, O Lord, I come. Be thou merciful unto me, O King of mercy. Deliver speedily from the power of death, O Lord of life." The sounds gradually ceased, but yet his lips continued to move. His lips lost their motion, but his eyes were fixed, full of hope, upon the cross. A film came over them. It passed away, and the light beamed up again, shone brightly for a moment, waned, vanished, and all was death. The eyes were still fixed upon the cross, but that bright thing, life, was there no more. To look at them, no one could say what was gone between that minute and the one before, and yet it was evident that they were now but dust. The light was extinguished, the wine was poured out, and it was but the broken lamp, the empty urn, that remained to go down into the tomb. Constance closed her eyes, and weeping bitterly, knelt down with the old monk, and joined in the prayer that he addressed to heaven. She then rose and seated herself by all that remained of her dead friend, feeling alone in all the world, solitary, friendless, desolate, and straining her sweet eyes upon the cold, unresponsive countenance of the dead, she seemed bitterly to drink to the dregs the cup of hopelessness which that sight offered. No one spoke. The monk himself was silent, seeming to think that the prayer he had offered to the deity was the only fitting language for the presence of the dead, when a sound was heard without, and the door, gently opening, admitted the form of Jekin Groby. The good clothier thought the old man still slept, as when he had left the cottage, and advanced on tiptoe for fear of waking him. But the lifted hand of the monk, the streaming eyes of Constance, and the cold, rigid stiffness of the face before him, warned him of what had happened, and pausing suddenly, he clasped his hands with a look of unaffected sorrow. "Good God!" cried he, "he is dead! Alas the day!" Constance's tears streamed afresh. "Lady," said the worthy man, in a kindly tone, "take comfort. He is gone to a better place than we have here, poor hapless souls. And surely, if all were as fitted for that place as he was, we should have little cause to fear our death, and our gossips little cause to weep. Take comfort, sweet lady, take comfort. Our God is too good for us to murmur when he cuts our measure short." There was something in the homely consolation of the honest Englishman that touched Constance to her heart, and yet she could not refrain from weeping even more than before. "Nay, nay, dear lady," continued Jekin, affected almost to tears himself, "you must come away from here. I cannot bear to see you weep so; and though I am but a poor clothier, a little fitted to put myself in his place that is gone, I will never leave you till I see you safe. Indeed I won't. Come, lady, into the other cottage hard by, and we will send some one to watch here in your place. Lord, Lord, to think how soon a fellow creature is gone! Sure I thought to find him better when I came back. Come, lady, come." "Perhaps I had better," replied Constance, drying her tears. "My cares for him are useless. Yet, though I murmur not at God's will, I must e'en weep, for I have lost a good friend, and the world has lost as good a man as ever it possessed. But I will go, for it is in vain to stay here and encourage unavailing grief." She then addressed a few sentences to the monk in French, thanking him for his charitable offices towards her dead friend, and begging him to remain there till she could send some one to watch the body, adding that if he would come after that to the adjoining cottage, she would beg him to convey to his convent a small gift on her part. The monk bowed his head and promised to obey, and Constance, giving one last look at the inanimate form of the excellent being she had just lost, followed Jekin Groby to the cottage hard by, where, begging to be left alone, she once more burst into tears, and let both her sorrow and despondency have way, feeling that sort of oppression at the heart which can be relieved but by weeping. It is needless to follow farther such sad scenes, to tell the blunt grief of Bradford when he returned and found that his errand had been in vain, or to describe the funeral of good Dr. Wilbraham, which took place the next day, for so custom required, in the little cemetery of Whitesand Bay. Immediately this was over, Lady Constance prepared to set out for Boulogne, hoping to find a refuge in the heart of France till she had time to consider and execute some plan for her future conduct. We have twice said that the sailor, in tying her to the plank on which she had floated from the shipwrecked vessel, had fastened to the end of the board nearest her feet one of her own leathern cases, for the purpose of keeping her head raised above the water; and in this, as it luckily happened, were all the jewels and the money which she had brought with her from London. It would doubtless have rendered her situation much more critical and interesting if she had been deprived of all such resources; but as the fact was so, it is necessary to state it. No difficulty, therefore, seemed likely to present itself in her journey to her own estates, except that which might arise in procuring a litter to convey her on her way, or in meeting with some female attendant willing to accompany her. The latter of these was soon done away with, for the daughter of the cottagers where she had lodged, a gay, good-humoured Picard, gladly undertook the post of waiting woman to the sweet lady, whose gentleness had won them all; and Bradford, who, from a soldier, a sailor, a shipwright, and a Rochester rioter, had now become a squire of dames, was dispatched to Boulogne to see if he could buy or hire a litter and horses. In the midst of all these proceedings, poor Jekin Groby was sadly agitated by many contending feelings. In his first fit of sympathy with Constance on the death of Dr. Wilbraham, he had, as we have seen, promised to accompany her to the end of her journey, whithersoever it might be; but the thoughts of dear little England, and his own fireside, and his bales of cloth, and his bags of angels, called him vehemently across the Channel, while curiosity, with a certain touch of mercantile calculation, pulled him strongly towards the court at Calais. Notwithstanding, he resolved, above all things, to act handsomely, as he said, towards the lady, and accordingly he accompanied Bradford to Boulogne to ascertain if they could by any way get off trudging after her, the Lord knew where, as he expressed it, though he vowed he was very willing to go if he could be of any service. After the sailor and his companion had been absent about 6 hours, Constance began to be impatient, and proceeded to the door of the cottage to see if she could perceive them coming. Gazing for a few minutes on the road to Boulogne, she beheld, rising above the brow of the hill before her, a knight's pennon, and presently half a dozen spears appeared bristling up behind it. Judging that it was some accidental party proceeding towards Whitesand Bay, Constance retired into the cottage, and was not a little surprised when she heard the horses halt before the door. In a moment after, a gallant cavalier, in peaceful guise, armed only with his sword and dagger, entered the hut, and, doffing his plumed mortier to the lady, with a low inclination of the head, he advanced towards her, saying in French, "Have I the honour of speaking to the noble Lady de Grey, Countess of Boissy, and the Val de Marne?" "The same, Sir Knight," replied the lady. "To what, may I ask, do I owe the honour of your presence?" "His Highness Francis, King of France, now in the city of Boulogne," replied the knight, "hearing that a lady and his vassal, though born an English subject, had been shipwrecked on this shore, has chosen me for the pleasing task of inviting, in his name, the Countess de Boissy to repair to his royal court, not as a sovereign commanding the homage of his vassal, but as a gracious and a noble friend, offering service and goodwill. His Highness's sister also, the Princess Marguerite of Alençon, has sent her own litter for your convenience, with such escort as may suit your quality." Constance could only express her thanks. Had she possessed the power of choice, she would, of course, have preferred 1,000 times to have retired to the Val de Marne, without her coming being known to the French king or his court, till such time at least as the meeting between him and the King of England had taken place. However, as it was known, she could not refuse to obey, and she signified her readiness to accompany the French knight, begging him merely to wait till the return of a person she had sent to Boulogne for a litter. "He will not return, lady," replied the chevalier. "It was through his search for a litter at Boulogne, where none are to be had, all being bought for the court's progress to Ardres, that his highness became acquainted with your arrival within his kingdom." The knight was proceeding to inform her of the circumstances which had occurred, when the quick sound of horses' feet was heard without, joined to the clanging of arms, the jingling of spurs and trappings, and various rough cries in the English tongue. "Have her, but I will have her, by the Lord!" cried a voice near the door, and in a moment after, a knight, armed at all points, strode into the cottage. How now!" cried he. "What is all this? Ah, Monsieur de Bussy!" he continued, changing his language to broken, abominable French, "what are you doing with this lady?" "I come, Sir John Hardacre," replied the Frenchman, "to invite her to the court of Francis of France, whose vassal the lady is." "And I come," replied the Englishman, "to claim her for Henry, King of England, whose born subject she is, and ward of the crown, and so I will have her, and carry her to Guisnes as I am commanded." "That depends upon circumstances, sir," answered the Frenchman, offended at the tone of the other. "You are governor of Calais, but you do not command here. You are off the English pale, sir; and I say that unless the lady goes with you willingly and by preference, you shall not take her." "I shall not!" exclaimed the Englishman. "Who the devil shall stop me?" "That will I," answered the French knight, "and I tell you so to your beard." The Englishman laid his hand upon his sword, and the Frenchman was not slack to follow his example. But Constance interposed. "Hold, gentlemen!" cried she. "I am not worthy of such contention. Monsieur de Bussy, favour me by offering every expression of my humble duty to his highness your noble king, and show him that I intended instantly to have obeyed his command, and followed you to his court, but that I am compelled, against my will, to do otherwise. Sir John Hardacre, I am ready to accompany you." "If such be your will, fair lady," replied the French knight, "I have nothing but to execute your charge. However, I must repeat, that without your full consent you shall not be taken from French ground, or I am no true knight." An angry replication trembled on the lip of the English captain, but Constance stopped its utterance by once more declaring her willingness to go, and the French officer, bowing low, thrust back his sword into the sheath, and left the cottage, somewhat out of humour with the event of his expedition. When he and his followers had ridden away, Sir John Hardacre called up a lady's horse, which one of his men-at-arms led by the bridle, and after permitting Constance to make some change of her apparel, and to pay the good folks of the cottage for her entertainment, he placed her in the saddle, and holding the bridle himself, led her away at a quick pace towards Guisnes. He was a rough old soldier, somewhat hardened by long military service, but the beauty and gentleness of his fair prisoner, for such indeed may we consider poor Constance to have been, somewhat softened his acerbity, and after riding on for near an hour in silence, during which he revolved at least 20 ways of addressing the lady, without pleasing himself with any, he began by a somewhat bungling excuse, both for his errand and his manner of executing it. "I suppose, sir," replied Constance coldly, "that you have done your duty. Whether you have done it harshly or not is for you to consider." This quite put a stop to all the knight's intentions of conversation, and did not particularly soothe his humour, so that for many miles along the road he failed not every moment to turn round his head and vent his spleen upon his men in various high-seasoned curses, for faults which they might or might not have committed, as the case happened, the knight's powers of objurgation not only extending to the cursing itself, but also to supplying the cause. It was nearly 7 o'clock when they began to approach the little town of Guisnes, but at that season of the year the full light of day was still shining upon all the objects round about, and Constance might perceive, as they rode up, all the bustle and crowding and idle activity caused by the arrival of the court. Her heart sank when she saw it, and thought of all she might there have to endure. Under any other circumstances, however, it would have been a gay and pleasing sight, so full of life and activity, glitter and show, was everything that met the eye. To the southward of the town of Guisnes, upon the large open green that extended to the outside of the walls, were to be seen a vast number of tents, of all kinds and colours, with a multitude of busy human beings employed in raising fresh pavilions on every open space, or in decorating those already spread with streamers, pennons, and banners, of all the bright hues under the sun. Long lines of horses and mules loaded with armour or baggage, and ornamented with gay ribbons, to put them in harmony with the scene, were winding about all over the plain, some proceeding towards the town, some seeking the tents of their several lords, while, mingled amongst them, appeared various bands of soldiers, on horseback and on foot, with the rays of the declining sun glancing upon the heads of their bills and lances, and, together with the white cassock and the broad red cross, marking them out from all the other objects. Here and there, too, might be seen a party of knights and gentlemen cantering over the plain, and enjoying the bustle of the scene, or standing in separate groups, issuing their orders for the erection and garnishing of their tents, while couriers and pursuivants and heralds, in all their gay dresses, mingled with mule-drivers, lackeys, and peasants, armourers, pages, and tent-stretchers, made up the living part of the landscape. Behind lay the town of Guisnes, with the forest at its back, and a good deal nearer the castle, with its protecting guns pointed over the plain. But the most striking object, and that which instantly caught the eye, was a building raised immediately in front of the citadel, on which all that art could devise, or riches could procure, had been lavished, to render it a palace fit for the luxurious king who was about to make it his temporary residence. From the distance at which they were when it first struck her sight, Constance could only perceive that it was a vast and splendid edifice, apparently square, and seeming to offer a façade of about 400 feet on every side, while the sun, reflected from the gilding with which it was covered, and the immense quantity of glass that it contained, rendered it like some great ornament of gold enriched with brilliants. Although her heart was sad, and nothing that she saw tended to dispel its gloom, she could not refrain from gazing round with a half-curious, half-anxious glance upon all the gay objects that surrounded her, almost fearing to be recognised by some one who had known her at the court, now that she was led along as a kind of prisoner, a single woman amidst a band of rude soldiers. Sir John Hardacre, however, spurred on towards the bridge, which was nearly impassable from the number of beasts of burden and their drivers by which it was covered, and standing on but little ceremony with his fellow lieges, he dashed through the midst of them all, cursing one and striking another, and overturning a third, much to Constance's horror and dismay. Having reached the other side, and created by his haste as much confusion and discomfort as he could in his passage, the surly captain slackened his pace, muttering something about dignity, and turned his rein towards the temporary palace of the king. Proceeding slowly amidst a multitude, many of whom had seen her before, and whose notice she was very willing to escape, Constance's only resource was to fix her eyes upon the palace, and to busy herself in the contemplation of its splendour. Raised upon a high platform, it was not only visible from every part of the plain, but itself commanded a view of the whole gay scene below, with its tents and its multitudes, standing as a sort of nucleus to all the magnificence around. Before the gate to which Sir John Hardacre took his way, and which was itself a massy arch, flanked by two towers raised upon the platform, there stood two objects not unworthy of remark, as exemplifying the tastes of the day. The one was a magnificent fountain, richly wrought with arches and arabesques, painted in fine gold and blue, supporting a figure of Bacchus crowned with vine leaves, over whose head appeared inscribed in letters of gold, "Faites bonne chère qui voudra." No unmeaning invitation, for the fountain below ceased not to pour forth 3 streams of various coloured wines, supplied by reservoirs in the interior of the palace. On the other side of the gate were seen 4 golden lions supporting a pillar of bronze, round the shaft of which twined up various gilt wreaths, interlaced together, while on the summit stood a statue of Venus's purblind son and heir, pointing his arrows at those who approached the gate. Nevertheless, it was not on the charmed cup of the one, or the bended bow of the other chicken deity, that the battlemented arch above mentioned relied for defence, for in the several windows were placed gigantic figures of men in armour, apparently in the act of hurling down enormous rocks upon the head of whatever venturous stranger should attempt to pass the prescribed bound. At the same time appeared round about various goodly paintings of the demigods of history, the Herculeses, the Theseuses, the Alexanders, fabulous and historical, while showing strangely enough in such company, many a fat porter and yeoman of the lodge loitered about in rich liveries, as familiar with the gods and goddesses as if they had been born upon Olympus and swaddled in Tempe. In the flight of steps which led to this gate, Sir John Hardacre dismounted, and lifting Lady Constance from her horse, passed on into the inner court of the palace, which would indeed have been not only splendid but elegant, had it not been for a few instances of the same refined taste which we have just noticed. The 4 inner faces of the building were perfectly regular, consisting of 2 stories, the lower one of which was almost entirely of glass, formed into plain and bow windows alternately, each separated from the other by a slight column of gold, and surrounded by a multitude of arabesques and garlands. Exactly opposite to the gate appeared a vestibule, thrown a little forward from the building, and surmounted by 4 large bow windows, supported on trimmers, the corbels of which represented 1,000 strange gilt faces, looking out from a screen of olive branches cast in lead and painted green, while various tall statues in silver armour were ranged on either side, as guards to the entrance. It was towards this sort of hall that Sir John Hardacre led poor Constance de Grey, to whose heart all the gaiety and splendour of the scene seemed but to communicate a more chilling sensation of friendless loneliness; while the very gaze and whispering of the royal servants, who had all known of her flight, and now witnessed her return, made the quick blood mount into her beautiful cheek, as she was hurried along by the brutal soldier, without any regard to her feelings or compassion for her fears. "You must wait here, Mistress Constance," said he, having led her into the vestibule, which was full of yeomen and grooms, "while I go and tell the right reverend father the lord cardinal that I have brought you. "Here!" exclaimed Constance, casting her eyes around. "Surely you do not mean me to wait here amongst the servants?" "Why, where would you go?" demanded he, roughly. "I have no other place to put you. Wait here, and mind you don't run away again." Constance could support no more, and covering her face with her hands, she burst into a violent flood of tears. At that moment a voice that she knew struck her ear. "This to my cousin, sir!" exclaimed Lord Darby, who had heard what passed as he descended a flight of stairs which led away to the left. "This to my cousin, Sir John Hardacre. You would do better to jump off the donjon of Rochester Castle than to leave her here with lackeys and footboys." "And why should I not?" demanded the soldier, his eyes flashing fire. "Mind your own affairs, my Lord Darby, and let me mind mine." "You are an unfeeling old villain, sir," answered the earl, passing him and taking Constance by the hand. "Yes, sir, stare your fill. I say you are an unfeeling villain, and neither knight nor gentleman." The soldier laid his hand upon his sword, and drew it half out of its sheath. "Knock him down! Knock him down!" cried a dozen voices. "The precincts of the court! Out with him! Have his hands off!" Sir John Hardacre thrust his weapon back into the sheath, gazing, however, grimly around, as if he would fain have used it upon some one. "Your brutal violence, sir," said Lord Darby, "will bring upon you, if you heed not, a worse punishment than I can inflict. Yet you will not find me, in a proper place, unwilling to give you a lesson in what is due to a lady. Come, Constance, I will lead you to her highness, where you will meet, I am sure, a kind reception. You, sir, do your errand to my lord cardinal, who shall be informed by me of your noble and knightly treatment of the Lady de Grey." Thus saying, he led Constance through a long corridor to an antechamber, wherein stood two of the queen's pages. Here Lord Darby paused, and sent one of the attendants to request an audience, taking the opportunity of the time they waited to soothe the mind of his fair cousin, by informing her of all that had passed in her absence, and assuring her that the queen had ever been her warmest defender. All the news that he gave her, of course, took a heavy weight from Constance's mind, and drying her eyes, she congratulated him gladly on his approaching marriage, and would fain, very fain, have asked if he could give her any such consolatory information in regard to Darnley. But the earl had never once mentioned his name, and she knew not how to begin the subject herself. While considering and hesitating whether to ask boldly or not, the queen's page returned and ushered them to her presence. Constance was still much agitated, and even the kind and dignified sweetness, the motherly tenderness with which Catherine received her, a tenderness which she had not known for so long, overcame her, and she wept as much as if she had been most unhappy. The queen understood it all, and sending Lord Darby away, she soon won Constance to her usual placid mood, and then, questioning her of all the dangers and sorrows she had undergone, she gave up the best of all balms, sympathy, trembling at her account of the shipwreck, and melted even to tears by the death of the good clergyman. Chapter 37.